Well, good morning, church. So, did you know that Christmas is later this week? Kind of snuck up on us, didn't it? Hey, a few scheduling things. So, one, I mentioned this last week, but our Christmas Eve service has become one of our favorite events as a church family, and it's this week. And one of the things that many of you do is you invite friends to this, you invite coworkers. If you have family in town, you often invite them, and that's a big blessing. It's always a joy to see people, that just new faces around here on Christmas Eve. In fact, several of you have told me this week just stories of people you've invited using our invitation cards, and you can find these at any of our exits. And so these are just a really simple way to tell people about our Christmas Eve service, whether this is just people you see out and about running errands, which I heard several stories this past week about that, or just people you know, friends you know. We'd love you to invite these people to our Christmas Eve service this coming week. It'll be at 5 o'clock. And then also, just so you know, the schedule for the next few weeks. So a week from today, December 26th, and then the following week, January 2nd, Sundays will look a little different. We're going to have one combined service at 9:30 on both those days. No Bible class and no PM service. So next 2 weeks, just one combined service, 9:30. Office hours are going to be a little bit different for the next few weeks. You can see that on the screen. For Wednesdays, no Wednesday night class this coming Wednesday, December 22nd. And then the next week, which will be December 29th, there is an area-wide service at Edmond. And I'll be speaking there, and so I expect you to all be there and hold up signs and have lots of applause. So no class this Wednesday. There's an area-wide on December 29th. Now, make sure I got all that correct. Okay, so here's a truth to begin with, our sermon time today. Not everything is going to go exactly the way you want it to this week. So you just need to kind of realize that. One thing that I've learned about myself, and maybe this is awful, but I actually feel a little bit better about my life when I hear stories about other people's holiday plans not going well. It just makes me feel better. So I like Jimmy Fallon hashtags, and so he did a Christmas fail one, and I want to read you a few of these. And so these are just tweets from people around the country about things that didn't go exactly according to plan around Christmas. So here's one from someone named Vitamin Pete, who says, "After our Christmas tree fell over for the 6th time, my dad decided to leave it down and just lay the presents around it." Here's another one from Amy Catherine. "After opening presents, my sister walked up to my parents and said, 'I'm not complaining, I'm just asking, is this it?'" Oh, that one hurts. And then from Nikki Ray, who says, "Last year, my dad had me wrap a coffee maker for my mom, and my mom had me wrap a coffee maker for my dad. I said nothing." So it's not going to go exactly the way you think it's going to go. Christmas is really stressful. The market research company recently did a holiday stress survey, and I know that's an interesting image. 88% of people said that this time of year is the single most stressful time of the whole year. 88%. So by far and away, most of us think that it's going to be a time of anxiety this particular week. And there's so many reasons for that. You know these reasons. You've got financial stress. How are we going to make ends meet? You got the people-pleasing part of you that's like, I'm going to see all these people, and I want to make sure they all have a good time. Everybody has to be happy. So everybody's, even if you're not a people-pleaser, you're going to see all these people, and that's stressful. Then you've actually got safety concerns. So I read this. So this is from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Last year, 17,500 people went to the ER for decoration-related injuries. So you've got that going on. And so a lot of us think Christmas is going to be like this, just a stereotypical picture of Santa and some kids. But the reality is, Christmas is actually much more like this. This is just how it goes. You know, another image that we often conjure in our minds when we think about Christmas is the little town of Bethlehem. And this is normally, when we sing the song, we imagine it's something like this. People go to bed early, they turn their lamps off, the fireplaces are lit, they're tucked away in their beds. It's this simple, serene, quiet night in which Jesus will enter into the world. Well, that scene is not necessarily true. Like if you were to actually take a time machine and go back 2,000 years and show up in Bethlehem the day that Jesus was born, it probably wouldn't look like this. And the reason I say that is because there's so many other factors in the world pressing upon this particular moment that I actually think that the 24 hours surrounding Jesus' birth is arguably at least one of the most stressful 24-hour periods in human history. And so let me tell you some of the reasons why. So one would be, so if you go back before the birth of Jesus to 63 BC, this is when Rome took over Jerusalem. Now, when Rome would take over various cities, usually one of two things happened. Either A, once the takeover happened, some of these cities actually welcomed it because it was so chaotic and things weren't going well, and they wanted Rome to come in and bring order and peace and stability. And so some nations said, yes, come on in, we need you. Other nations, like Israel, said, over my dead body, will you take over this town? And so Israel would have been one of these nations that really pushed back. They viewed Rome simply like the next Babylon or the next Assyria. Okay, you're going to have your heyday because you've got great military, but we serve Yahweh, and Yahweh's going to bring you down. And actually, we're going to help Yahweh bring you down. And so you've got this like pretty immense political tension going on behind the scenes of Jesus' birth. And so Luke, when he records the story, he tells us there's a census. And so this is where the Roman Empire would ask everybody to go to their hometown to register. And there was really one reason they did this. It's because of taxes. And so everybody had to go to their hometown, and they would go to this certain office, and someone would get this piece of paper out, and they would have their name on them. And then this person would ask them questions like, well, where do you live now? And how much livestock do you have? And how much land do you have? And how much money do you make? And they would record all these things for the specific reasons so that they could tax them. And so you can imagine this didn't really sit well with Jewish people who believed that they were God's people and lived on God's land and they followed God's law. And then Rome comes in and says, we want to take attendance so we can pad our pocketbooks. And so again, you have this going on behind the scenes. This is immense tension here. In fact, so a few years after the birth of Jesus, this is 60 AD, so this is after Jesus has gone back into heaven, but before the fall of Jerusalem, there's this Jewish rebellion where some Jews go into Jerusalem and they actually take over this Roman office. And do you know the very first thing they do when they take over this Roman office? They burn all the census information. Like they just grab that file and they burn it because they hated it. Like the census reminded the Jewish people that something was wrong. Someone else was trying to enslave them. And so you have all this going on behind the scenes, and then Mary and Joseph, they come into the picture. So Joseph is somewhat of a righteous man. He has a good job. Life is going really well for him. He's betrothed to this beautiful woman named Mary, and everything is really set for them. And then all of a sudden, they have to stop their entire life to go to Bethlehem to do this census. So you got to think they're not really happy about this already. It's about an 80-mile journey, would have taken several days to make. And then to throw on top of all of that, Mary's pregnant. And so with Mary being pregnant, you really have two things going on here to add anxiety to the situation. One is just the scandal of the whole thing. I mean, Joseph's a devout Jew, a righteous Jew, and in that day, this kind of a scandal would be thought of as like, you need to leave town. Like this would bring disgrace upon Joseph, upon Joseph's parents, and so he's having to deal with that reputationally. Like, what do I do here? Like, you talk about anxiety. And part of him really cares about Mary, and he loves Mary, and he wants to spend the rest of his life with Mary, but this other part of him feels really betrayed, and so he's not sure what to do. And so they get on their donkey, and they start making this trip, and Joseph decides, okay, I'm not going to divorce her. And they're making this trip, and then you just got to deal with like the biology of the pregnancy. Like Mary's at the very end. Like she's 8-9 months pregnant. Now I've never been 9 months pregnant, but I've been married to a woman twice who was 9 months pregnant. Aren't you glad I've never been 9 months pregnant? I actually remember one time where, this is 2009, summer, it's really hot. Mary's 8.5 months pregnant. And there was a particular day where a summer storm came through, and there's this downpour happening in our neighborhood. I'm out of town at the moment, and my 2 dogs, medium-sized, 60-pound dogs, they get out of the backyard and are running around the streets. And who has to go chase them down but 8.5-month pregnant Mary? And that was the day we decided to get rid of those dogs. So I remember feeling so guilty about that. So Mary in the Bible, like she's about to deliver. Like, can you imagine sitting down with like a 16-year-old girl and say, all right, here's your delivery plan. You can get on this horse. You're going to ride to Tulsa. There's a Motel 6 that you're going to go into. There's not going to be any rooms available, but they have a really nice continental breakfast area. And so you're going to go in here, and you're going to have a baby. There's not going to be any doctors. There's not going to be any nurses. You're not going to get an epidural. By the way, this baby's going to be the Son of God. So you see what I mean when I say this particular 24-hour period was one of the most stressful 24-hour periods I think that anybody has ever had. Now, in the middle of all this, there's this truth that I really want you to hear and believe and understand, because this could be I think, a game changer for your week. Like, this truth is for people who find themselves full of stress, like right now. So here's the truth. Chaos is the birthplace of Emmanuel. Like, think about that. The moment when God decided, I'm going to make my entrance into the world, was not this quiet, serene moment where everything was great. No, it was absolute pandemonium. You've got the political upheaval. You've got financial disarray. You've got a complete travel failure. You've got a scandal. You've got all the pregnancy issues at play. You've got dirty floors. You've got clucking chickens. And that's the moment that God says, okay, I'm coming into the world. Chaos. Chaos is the birthplace of Emmanuel. And so this week, you're going to have chaos, or at least some of you are going to have chaos. You're going to have travel chaos, trying to figure out when and where to go see your loved ones. You're going to have family chaos. You're going to see people you haven't seen in a long time, and some of those people are going to stress you out, and you're going to get in some arguments, and you're not sure what to do about that. There's going to be cooking chaos. There's going to be cleaning chaos, like chaos. But in the same way that Jesus came into the world in the middle of that chaos 2,000 years ago, so this truth it applies to you and I, like right now. Chaos can be the birthplace of Emmanuel, like for you, like this week. So on one level, you could just get through the week, and maybe you're sad and you're stressed out, or it's not going to be a great week, and you're already looking forward to the beginning of next year. Let's just move past this. Or for some of you, through the chaos, you might actually discover the depth of this particular promise, the promise of Emmanuel. But the truth is, you actually have to have the eyes to see it. So there's a great quote I read a few months ago that I've really been thinking about. It's from a lady named Marilyn Robinson, and she says this: "It has seemed to me sometimes as though the Lord breathes on this poor gray ember of creation and turns it to radiance for a moment or year or the span of a life. And then it sinks back into itself again, and to look at it, no one would know it had anything to do with fire or light. Whenever you turn your eyes, the world can shine like transfiguration. You don't have to bring a thing to it except a little willingness to see." And I really enjoy that particular idea. The image that's really stuck with me is the image of an ember. And you can imagine in your mind's eye an ember, and it can look dead, like there's nothing there. But then you get a little wind blowing through that ember, and all of a sudden, it glows with life. And so she's articulating this truth that there is a sense in which you can look at your ordinary experience, and any moment can actually become a moment that glows with the glory of God. It simply takes the eyes to see it. And you've had moments like that. Maybe someone told me last week, for her, it was this moment in the middle of the night when she stepped outside and there was a lightning storm happening, and she felt the presence of God more so than she had ever felt it in her life. Or maybe for you, it's this moment where you're very vulnerable with someone you trust, and you're talking about things you don't normally talk about, and you get this deep sense that you're loved. Maybe that's your moment where the world feels like it's glowing with the glory of God. Or maybe for you, it's that day you took a walk by yourself early in the morning, and there was dew on the grass, and you looked through the woods, and you saw that deer standing still, and you just took a moment, and you just stood there with the deer. And maybe for you, that's your moment where you say, yeah, there was something different about that particular time. Well, the truth is, in these moments, like when we feel it, the Emmanuel promise is like right there. Okay, I know God's with me. But the truth is, that's happening all the time. There are simply those people that see it and those people that don't see it. And so what I would really encourage you to do this week is at least ask yourself the question, how can I be the person that could recognize the promise of Emmanuel in the middle of a week full of chaos? Like, what could I do? And so I want to share with you two very, very simple ideas from the text in the book of Luke about how you could perhaps recognize the presence of God this week more than you normally do. So two really simple ideas. The first one is this: savor the simple. It's like this time of year has the tendency to get really complicated, and there's so many things to do, so many extra things to think about. But if you can learn to savor what is very simple, then what will happen is, number one, your week's going to be a lot less anxious, but then number two, you'll probably recognize that ember, that glowing presence of God in your week. Just savor the simple. So for example, I want you to look at the text here. So Luke chapter 2, I want you to zoom in on where Mary is at this moment. Verse 6. While they were there, as in they're in the middle of this political, economic, physical, financial, emotional chaos, while they were there, the time came for a baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. I don't know why, for some reason, I was really drawn to the detail of her wrapping the baby in this cloth. And it just struck me that everything outside of that moment really was falling apart. Again, you had Rome, you had the census, everything had gone wrong with the delivery. It was not supposed to happen this way. Everything's going wrong, and yet Mary can just pause, take this baby, hear his cry, feel the warmth of his skin, wrap him so that he's not so cold, and then rock him. And there's something so beautiful about that particular moment. Now, later the shepherds come and the shepherds go, but Mary's just there bonding with her son. And then we have this really wonderful line, happens twice in Luke, verse 19, verse 51. Mary treasured these things in her heart. Now, were there things to do? You better believe it. Like they had nothing. They had no plans for where to take this baby. Like, do you need some kind of a carrying case? Like, I don't know if the innkeeper is going to come down and check the car seat on the donkey. Like, there's definitely things that need to be done. Like, how are we going to feed the baby going forward? How are we going to clothe him? How is Mary going to recover from from the delivery. Like there's so many questions. There's so many things to do, so many plans to be made, but in this moment, she just sits there with this beautiful baby soaking in the glory of God. She savored the simple. And so I would ask you to think about this week, what would it look like for you this week to savor the simple? So maybe it would look like right before you open a gift, just taking a really deep breath and just enjoying the moment of anticipation before you rip the paper off the present. I've started doing this now for several years. My kids think it's the dumbest thing in the world, but I will just hold a gift on the couch and I'll just sit there, sometimes for 30 seconds, sometimes for a whole minute, just enjoying the moment. That's one way to savor the simple. Maybe before you devour your food at whatever feast you're going to have, maybe you take a moment to simply really recognize how grateful you are for the bite that you're about to eat. Or maybe you take a moment this week and instead of running away from the sadness that you feel from the person that's not there, maybe you actually take some time to honor that person. Maybe it's just in your own mind, or maybe it's with some other people. Maybe you say, can we just take a few minutes and talk about the person that's not there? Savor the simple. Or it could be, here's one more, maybe there's going to be a day in the next few days, or a time, where there's a group of people all busy in the kitchen doing things, and you're going to peek around the corner into the living room, and you're going to see that one person sitting on the couch, and she doesn't hear very well. And maybe instead of staying in the kitchen, you go and sit right next to her on the couch. And maybe the conversation is not going to be great, but you're just going to enjoy sitting in the presence of a very deep soul. Savor the simple. Here's another thing you can do this week to discover and pay attention to that glowing ember, the glory of God. You can also follow the rays. There was a line from C.S. Lewis I read many years ago, and I love this particular idea. The line is this. Lewis says, one's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. And the idea he's trying to get across is that, so like for example, if we walked outside in the parking lot right now, you would see the asphalt, you would see trees, you would see the red brick of the girls' dorms at Oklahoma Christian. Like you would see lots of things. And the reason you can see those things is because the sun's rays are illuminating them. And so if you were to take a single beam of sunlight or a single ray from the sun and trace it backwards, then you would travel 93 million miles through space, and eventually you would actually reach the sun itself. And so what Lewis is trying to say with this metaphor is that anytime you see something good or hopeful or righteous or generous or praiseworthy in this life, if you start tracing back, where did that come from? Eventually you will find that that good thing came from the giver of all good gifts, from God himself. And so one practice that you can adopt in your life in order so you can recognize what God's doing in your world is very simple. Just follow the rays. Where did this thing even come from? In fact, going back to the text in Luke, I want to look at another thing Mary says. So she sings this famous song in chapter 1, "My soul glorifies the Lord." Well, it's really interesting the point at which Luke records that she sings that. She doesn't sing it in the gospel account after the angel speaks to her, which to me that would make the most sense. The angel comes down and says, hey, you're going to give birth to the Son of God. That's when she should burst into song. She bursts into song actually not after speaking to a heavenly being, but after speaking to a human being. It's right after she's just talked to Elizabeth. And so she's had this meeting, and she's had this moment with Elizabeth where she realizes that Elizabeth's going to give birth to John the Baptist, and Mary's going to give birth to Jesus. But I want to highlight the human encounter. So Mary has just had a conversation with a person with eye color and hair color and height and weight and a personality and an IQ and a certain accent with which she talks. And she sees this human being and has this interaction with her. And then she bursts out into the song, "My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, because he's been mindful of the humble state of his servant. And from now on, all generations are going to be, will call me blessed. Praise his name." And I love the trajectory of her thought here, because she starts with the human being. It's just a relative. She knows this person. She has memories with this person. But Mary has enough spiritual insight to recognize and understand that this good, beautiful, wonderful person in front of her comes from the mind of a good and beautiful God. So she's following the rays of what she sees, what she can observe, to the source from which that thing comes. And again, if you want to have a week in which your anxiety isn't as high, and that you actually enjoy your week, and that you actually recognize the glory of God in your week, again, the first thing is you just savor the simple, but the second thing is you follow the rays. And so what would this look like in your week? Maybe this looks like Christmas morning. Maybe you're just with your family, or you're with some relatives. I don't know who you're with, but maybe you see a 5-year-old girl open a gift and go bananas. And she's just going crazy. It's the gift she's always dreamed of. And maybe for you it looks like recognizing, where does that joy come from? Well, the joy of that child comes from the joy of the Lord. Charles Chesterton wrote this years ago, and I've quoted this before, but I'll just briefly remind you. He has this great line in one of his pieces where he says, "God is both older and younger than we think." So obviously he's older, we get that one. But it's also true that God's younger than us. Like, in his being, he carries the heart of a child. And so maybe when you see that kid, you think, wow, she gets that from God. That's following the rays. Or here's another time this might happen. Maybe your meal's done Christmas Day, and you're in the living room watching TV or talking to some of your family members, and you lean forward in your chair and you can see through the doorway that there's maybe one person left in the kitchen. And maybe this person's already worked 6, 7, 8 hours on the meal, but they're in the kitchen and they're taking care of the cleanup. Now, several things could happen at this moment. You could feel guilty for this, which you probably should. You probably need to get out of the chair and go help this person. But another thing you could think is this: where does that come from? That kind of sacrifice actually comes from the sacrifice of God himself. You see, there's a way to trace that backwards. Where does this person get this grit, this effort, this determination, this love just to keep blessing the family? Well, that comes from God himself. And so again, if you learn to practice this, again, the whole world just starts to pulsate with the glory of God, because we really do come from his mind. And so every good thing and every perfect gift really does come down from the Father of heavenly lights, as James chapter 1 tells us. So you savor the simple and you follow the rays. So I heard this story a few months ago, and it's a story in which you can really see both of these at play, or at least you can practice savoring the simple, following the rays. So as I tell the story, that's what I want you to think about. How can you savor the simple, and how can you follow the rays in this super interesting story? So it's 2007. We'll start there. There's this scientist, and he's out on a boat, and he's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and he sends this robot submarine down, and they're doing all this research at the bottom of the ocean. And so that this submarine has to travel 1 mile down. So this is the very bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So there's no light. I mean, the pressure is immense down there. And the scientists are actually doing lots of different things with this particular submarine. But as it moves along the ground, it comes across this tiny octopus. It's about the size of a cantaloupe, and it's attached to a rock. And so they look at the octopus and think, oh, that's interesting, but then they just move on, because that's not their primary objective on this particular research that they're doing. So they do other things. Well, about 3 months later, the boat's back out at this exact same place in the Atlantic Ocean, and it has to go down to do some similar research, and then it notices that this octopus is still there, like hasn't moved. And so they think, that's interesting that an octopus, it's been 3 months, and this like hadn't moved at all. Well, then they look even closer and they shine this light, and there's this camera on this robot down there, and they discover that there's all these eggs that this octopus is protecting. And so they actually count them, and there's 160 little baby octopus eggs. And they think, well, that's interesting. So now we get why this octopus is not moving. So they go back up to the service, and these scientists are not experts on octopus. And so they consult with other researchers, and these researchers or scientists tell them, hey, yeah, this is what's happening, and usually an octopus will last 3, 4, 5 months, and then the babies will hatch. But however, this is a deep-sea octopus, and so most of our research and our information comes from the freshwater octopuses, so we don't really know how long this is going to last. And so it's about summer at this point, and so they start sending this submarine down like once a month. So June, still there. July, still there. August, still there. Like, it has not moved. September, still there. October, still there. November, still there. December, like, literally hasn't moved. And so then, now they're starting to get really interested, and so they're doing more and more research on this, and they learn that when an octopus lays her eggs, at least freshwater octopus, this is the final act of life. So she decides, this is the final thing I'm going to do, and that octopus will sit there until the babies hatch, and then that octopus will die. And so now these scientists, they're like really interested, like, what? Like, this is crazy that she would just this would be the very final thing that she does. And so they keep sending their submarine down there month after month. Well, then at one point, all these crabs start to surround her, and they're like, oh no, like the crabs are trying to get the eggs. Like, what are we going to do? And the octopus she's getting paler and paler and paler, so she's really weak. But then these scientists think, well, we can't really interfere. Like, we're not sure what to do. And so they decide that they're not going to interfere, and they actually pull the submarine back up, and they think, okay, well, this is the end. Well, then they send it back down about a month later, and this octopus has somehow used what tiny amount of energy she had left to destroy all these crabs. There's just like, there was this big battle that happened. There's all these like little pieces of crab everywhere, and like, what? Like, how is she doing this? And so then they get to 18 months. Then they get to 2 years, and she hasn't moved. Like, literally, she's not moved from the rock. And then they're starting to ask these questions like, how is this biologically possible? Because she's not eating. In fact, one day they go down there and they try to put some food in front of her, just like, please eat. She won't eat. And what they discovered is that what happens to these octopuses, I don't know if that's the right plural way to say octopus, but what happens to creatures like this is that the brain starts out like the symphony. Here's a metaphor they said. The brain's like a symphony. You got all these instruments, and they're all playing their part and doing their thing in the prime of life. But for this octopus, as she got closer and closer to the end, sections of the brain just started to shut down, one by one. So the part of her brain in which she would go out and find food, that shuts down. Part of her brain, even used for vision, eventually shut down. And so the only part of her brain still functioning was simply this part that says, keep these babies alive. So 2 years turns into 2.5 years. 2.5 years turns into 3 years, and this octopus has not left the rock. Finally, they go down one day, and for the first time, she's not there. They can see parts of her body, but all of these eggs have opened up, and they start looking in the surrounding area, and there's all these little baby octopuses, and they're just swimming about. And so this particular octopus set the world record for the longest gestation period of any creature ever recorded. 4.5 years. She didn't leave the rock for 4.5 years. And so just to give you some perspective, here's what happened in those 4.5 years. So she lays the eggs in 2007. In 2008, the first iPhone was released, and the economy crashed. She's still there. 2009, Usain Bolt broke the world record for the 100-meter dash. Michael Jackson died. She was still there. 2010, the Chilean miners were rescued. 2011, Steve Jobs and Osama bin Laden die. And she's just still there, killing crabs and protecting her babies. It was really interesting when I heard the story on a podcast, and it was not a religious podcast at all. It was a very scientific podcast, and I don't know this 100%, but my my guess is that the hosts of the podcast are not Christians, they're not believers, they're atheists. But it was really interesting because when they got to the end of this story that they were telling, they found no language to describe how they were feeling about this creature who had spent 4.5 years dying to protect her babies. And so in the final 2 minutes of the episode, they had to resort to religious language. They used words like awe and words like sacrifice, words like love. You could tell that these people who didn't believe in God were moved by what had happened with this creature a mile down in the ocean. And so here's all I would say. When you savor the simple and you follow the rays, then you might just discover that the world really is like an ember, which for those of us who have the eyes to see and the ears to hear will glow with the glory of God. You see, that octopus on one level is, sure, it's just an octopus. But what if on another level it's not an octopus at all? Like, think about why we're moved by that. The ability for somebody, something, someone to lay down one's life so that another might live. Well, we're all moved by that. That's the story of the gospel. In fact, when the angel comes to visit Joseph and Mary, he says, this baby will save people from their sins. And so, yes, this week's going to be complicated. It's going to be stressful. For some of you, it might be sad. However, God came into the world for a specific reason so that he himself could die to take away your sins and my sins to allow us to live. And you do not have to be perfect to believe in or follow that kind of a God. All you have to do is bring who you are, not who you think you should be, and then trust that his grace is enough to cover you and to carry you. So we're going to sing this new song that we've learned, and I'm so glad Scott and his team have taught it to us. It's a song about bringing yourself to God just as you are. All your flaws, all your imperfections, all your stress, and allowing the power of Jesus to overshadow that which threatens to overwhelm you. And so as we sing this song, I invite you to give your burdens to the Lord. If there's any need that you have that you want addressed in a public way, we'd be happy to take care of that for you. We'll pray for you this morning. If you'd like to give your life to Jesus in baptism, we'd love to do that for you as well. Let's stand and sing.